I on? Am I on now? Am I? Am I? I could put it closer. That's too much. No. Just so you're happy. I'm trying to make everybody happy. So we weren't ready for that video of the IRR program. My son teaches in that program. He was not on the Alaska trip, but I was watching closely early on, and they were showing video of the rock climbing in Colorado and the ropes and everything, and he was one of the instructors showing the person how to tie the ropes and go down the rope. So he graduated from that program, 10, 12, 15 years ago, and then they asked him to come back and teach. So he teaches whitewater rescue. He teaches mountain rappelling and mountain rescue. He also is a paramedic and teaches EMT. And what else does he teach? Well, first responders. And then he teaches a class about disaster management. So he's been on some of the trips where they went to either hurricanes or tornadoes for cleanup. So it was kind of cool to see that. Anyway, are we on? Are we live? We're ready to go. All right. In the past, for Christmas, everybody kind of expects a special service. And in the past, what I've done, I had a sermon I did about a Christmas quiz. So I'm going to ask a few questions and see how well you know your Christmas history. How many wise men came to see Jesus? Anyone else want to guess? We don't know. We don't know. We know there were 3 gifts, and we know that was plural, wise men plural, but we were never told how many. It could have been 2. It could have been 20. We don't know. But history, or the way it's been portrayed in Christianity, is that there were 3 because there was 3 gifts. It was just an assumption, but we're not told. The wise men showed up on the very night Jesus was born. True or false? False. In fact, the Bible says that he was in a building. He was in a cottage. He had moved from the manger into a cottage before the wise men showed up. So the modern depiction of the wise men and the shepherds together at the crib side is erroneous. We can't make that statement. Jesus was born in December. True or false? False. And it's interesting. Does anybody get the review? Have you gotten the December issue of the review? There is an interesting article in here that I just want to share a couple of things with you about the birth of Jesus. And what this author has done is he took the history of Zechariah. Remember, Zechariah was visited by the angel while he was in the temple doing his work, and he was told he was going to have a son, John the Baptist. Well, Zechariah, according to biblical evidence, would have been serving in the temple the last week of April, based on his sequence, the last week of April. He was told he was going to have a child, so he could not, Elizabeth, his wife, probably wouldn't have gotten pregnant until after we went home, which was the first week of June. We're told in the Bible that in the 6th month of her pregnancy, so she got pregnant right away in June, 6 months later would have been what time? This is Elizabeth now, not Mary. Would have been December. And it was at this time, as soon as Mary had been impregnated, she went to visit Elizabeth. And what happened in Elizabeth's womb? The child jumped because he was in the presence of Jesus. Would have been in the womb of Mary in December, which means he would have been born probably in September. Now, the other clue for the birth of Jesus, it says, while the shepherds were in the fields watching their flocks. They don't watch their flocks in December and January. In fact, they take their flocks out in October. So September, early October would have been a perfect time frame for the birth of Jesus, based on the evidence of backtracking from Zechariah, Elizabeth's pregnancy, Elizabeth and Mary coming together in December. So something happened in December. Mary had been impregnated by the Holy Spirit, obviously, since she hadn't laid with her husband to be yet. But anyway, I was just kind of messing with you a little bit. The modern story of Christmas really doesn't hold up to biblical. So hopefully I didn't ruin your Christmas story and your decorations and all of the things. But, sometimes when you get into this, I think it's kind of cool, but what we celebrate and what is represented today in Christianity and in the world about Christmas really isn't very accurate. It's come down through generations. It's come down as stories, and it's kind of gotten compiled and compressed and isn't really accurate. But we don't worship the day Jesus was born, do we? Not really, because the Bible doesn't tell us, and there's obviously a reason God didn't tell us when he was born. It wasn't really the thing he wanted us to focus on. Although I will suggest, and I'm going to suggest today in my sermon, that the birth of Jesus was extremely important. A number of years ago, I came across this story, and I want to share it with you because I thought it was very relevant. Each December, I vowed to make Christmas a calm and peaceful experience. I had cut back on the non-essential obligations, extensive card writing, endless baking, decorating, and overspending. Yet I still found myself exhausted, unable to appreciate the precious family moments. And of course, the true meaning of Christmas. My son Nicholas was into kindergarten, public school kindergarten that year. It was an exciting season for a 6-year-old. For weeks, he had been memorizing songs for his school's winter pageant. I didn't have the heart to tell him I would work the night of the production. Unwilling to miss his shining moment, I spoke with his teacher. She assured me that there'd be a dress rehearsal the morning of the presentation, and all parents unable to attend that evening were welcome to come. Fortunately, Nicholas seemed happy with the compromise. So the morning of the dress rehearsal, I filed in 10 minutes early, found a spot on the cafeteria floor, and sat down. Around the room, I saw several other parents quietly scampering to their seats. As I waited, the students were led into the room. Each class, accompanied by their teacher, sat cross-legged on the floor. Then each group, one by one, rose to perform their song. Because the public school system had long stopped referring to the holiday as Christmas, I didn't expect anything other than fun commercial entertainment. Songs of reindeer, Santa Claus, snowflakes, and good cheer. So when my son's class rose to sing Christmas Love, I was taken aback by its bold title. Nicholas was aglow, as were all of his classmates, adorned in fuzzy mittens, red sweaters, and bright snow caps upon their heads. Those in the front row, center stage, held up large letters one by one to spell out the title of the song. As the class would sing, C is for Christmas, a child would hold up the C. Then H is for happy, and on, till each child, holding up his portion, had presented the complete message, Christmas Love. The performance was going smoothly until suddenly we noticed her, a small, quiet girl in the front row holding the letter M upside down. Totally unaware her letter M appeared as a W. The audience of first through sixth graders snickered at this little one's mistake, but she had no idea they were laughing at her. So she stood tall, proudly holding her W. Although many teachers tried to shush the children, the laughter continued until the last letter was raised and we saw it all together. A hush came over the audience and the eyes began to widen. In that instant, we understood the reason we were there, why we celebrated the holiday in the first place, why even in the chaos there was a purpose for our festivities. When the last letter was held high, the message read loud and clear. Christ was love. In Luke 2, we hear the story. For today in the city of David, there's been born for you a Savior who is Christ the Lord. Now, if you've ever watched the Peanuts Christmas special, where this story in Luke is read, and if, for those of you who don't know, Charles Schulz was a very strong Christian, and he had a lot of Christian symbology in much of his stories, in the Peanuts characters and in some of the Peanuts stories. So it shouldn't surprise us that this would have been included in the Christmas program. Regardless of whether it was December or April or September, something special happened on that day. About 4 BC, not 0. Our chronology of the birth of Christ is not accurate. There's a lot of things we don't have accurate. You see, Herod died in 4 BC, and if Herod was killing the babies and Jesus had been born, Jesus had to be born before 4 BC. So when we talk about we're now 2021 years, actually it's 2025 years after the birth of Jesus, not 2021. Something special happened that day. And I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in the Christmas story and the babe wrapped in swaddling clothes, and we miss some of the symbology of what took place. For instance, the crib that Jesus would have been put in was a feeding trough. Now, in North America, we have some weird ideas about what a feeding trough looked like. We have this little wooden thing that we build. It was made out of stone. Jesus at his birth was placed in a stone. He was at his death, too. When we think of the place where the nativity took place, we have this little wooden shed built out in a snowy field, and we have this mental picture of that because that's a North American stable. In the Middle East, the stable was a cave. And the only difference between a burial cave and a stable cave was the size of the opening in the Middle East. At Jesus' birth, he was born into a cave. In his death, he was placed into a cave. When Jesus was laid in the manger in swaddling clothes, those swaddling clothes would have been strips of cloth, no different than would have been used to wrap up a person in their burial cloths. So at the birth of Jesus, he was wrapped in strips, much like he would be when he was laid in the tomb. Bethlehem was the beginning of the journey that would lead Jesus to his death and his burial. But we don't see it that way today, do we? We don't see the birth of Jesus as the beginning of the sacrifice of the Son of God. To think that Jesus stepped down into this earth, into this planet, put on a human form, which was a huge condescension. He stepped down into humanity. That alone would have been an enormous sacrifice to begin with. But he stepped down into human form for the express purpose that he would one day die for us, that he would become the substitute, the lamb slain from the foundation of the earth. So when we think of Christmas, we think of gifts and Santa Claus and snow, and the first Christmas, if you will, if I can use that language, the birth of Christ, had none of that. We have so idealized and so removed the trappings of the reality of the experience of Christ. In the city of David, one who was born as the Savior. Jesus knew when he entered into this journey with his Father what it would lead to. Before he began the journey, he knew what the end was going to be, and he did it willingly on our behalf, knowing that we could not do for ourselves what only he could do for us. I think sometimes we really miss this. And I grew up in in a mainstream Christian church. I can remember going to Christmas programs. I remember the Advent season and how every week they light a candle until we got to the Christmas candle, and then all of the pomp and pageantry of churches with the choirs and all of this stuff, except for the angels who showed up with the shepherds. There really wasn't much pomp and pageantry at the birth of Jesus. It was a very humble beginning. In fact, the angels were amazed that humans didn't understand the magnitude of this event taking place in Bethlehem. Now, I visited Israel. I've been in Bethlehem, and if you go today to the supposed place of the birth of Jesus, it'll turn your stomach. Sorry, it turned mine. There's this huge church built over this tiny little cave, and people come in and they worship the spot and they kiss it and they do all kinds of strange things. And so we went down and we, underneath the altar of the main church, we went down underneath it and took pictures and watched people as they were rubbing cloths on this place where Jesus supposedly was laid. And of course, we don't know if this was the place. It wasn't identified until almost 400 years after the birth of Jesus, and it was done so based on speculation and guessing. So today, if you go to Jerusalem or you go to Bethlehem, yes, you can go visit a site that is purported to be the place of Jesus' birth, but we don't know. I wonder if God intended we not know the exact location, because maybe he didn't want us to go and treat it as an idol. So there's a song that came out a few years ago, and this song, we're going to sing it as our closing song, but the words are really significant to me. How many kings stepped down from their thrones? How many lords have abandoned their homes? How many greats have become the least for me? When you think about human nature and the way humans function, when people reach the top, whatever that is, whether it's in Congress or presidents or kings on earth, how many humans would have done what Jesus did by entering into such a subspecies as humans, to be born in such a primitive way, with no fanfare except for the shepherds who showed up. But I mean, think about it. These shepherds, smelly guys, been hanging around with sheep, haven't bathed in weeks probably, and they show up to see Jesus. This is the King of the universe, and this is his entourage, his greeting into this world. How many gods have poured out their hearts to romance a world that is all torn apart? How many fathers gave up their sons for me? Really powerful words. I know that if I were God, I wouldn't give up my son for you. This world sucks. Excuse my French. What's happening in the world around us as we see people dying, and today especially, when we look in 2021 at Christmas time, what do we see happening in our major streets today, in the major cities? Violence, robbery, people being carjacked and killed. And it's, there's only so much we can turn a blind eye to. Our world is falling apart. Do you think God knew this was going to happen? But he came anyway, in spite of that. He came and said, I have a way out for you. All you have to do is accept me. But what have we done? We have rejected him. We've turned Christmas into some sort of party time. We've turned it into something God never intended it to be. God gave the greatest gift of love ever given on his birthday, whenever that is. What do we do on Christmas? Well, the wise men came, and let's talk a little bit about the wise men, because it's interesting. We know they didn't come on the eve of his birth. It was possibly 3 to 6 months after Jesus was born. In fact, if the star above Bethlehem that appeared in the night was the angels, and I'm going to speculate it may have been the angels who were by the shepherds in the field, It would have taken them almost 6 months to journey from where they were in Mesopotamia to get to Jerusalem. So it's very possible that it was 6 months at least before the wise men showed up to see the baby Jesus. Now, who were these people? They were pagans. They were the magi or magicians from Mesopotamia. And it said that they knew the prophecy. How did they know the prophecy? Well, northern Mesopotamia is modern Iraq, northern Iraq. What prophet prophesied, or what prophets prophesied in Mesopotamia prior to the birth of Christ? Does anybody know? Anybody know the most famous prophet of Mesopotamia? Come on, anybody? It's in the Bible. His name was Balaam. Balaam was from Mesopotamia. He was a prophet of God. In fact, he prophesied that a star will arise out of Israel. A star. And the prophets, or the magi, the Zoroastrians, had read the ancient oracles of Balaam. You kind of wonder why the Jews hadn't read the ancient oracles and that they hadn't recognized this. In Numbers 24, verses 16 to 17, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and who knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob. A scepter shall arise from Israel and shall crush through the forehead of Moab and tear down all the sons of Sheth. This was Balaam and his prophecy in the book of Numbers from Mesopotamia. Remember, he had been called to curse the Israelites, and when he came, he said, I can only do what God allows me to do. And he ended up not cursing, but blessing the Israelites. So Balaam was an ancient magi, or at least somewhere in their history they had read the prophecies. But there was also another great prophet in Mesopotamia, or in Babylon, and his name was Daniel. And what did Daniel say? You are to know and discern that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza, moat, and even in times of distress. So what do we know from Daniel in the prophecy of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9? It literally predicted the very year in which Jesus was going to be born. Do you think that the Magi would have read that prophecy from Daniel? Probably. And so God had spoken to pagans, and they understood and accepted these prophecies and knew that Jesus was coming. And when they showed up in Jerusalem, these Magi, why were they amazed? Why were they stunned? Because the Jews didn't know. You don't even read your own stuff, they said. You don't follow your own prophecies. Didn't you know that the timing is now, and that the star who foretold this, Balaam who foretold the star, you didn't? And so now the Jews are like, well, I guess we better check to find out where the babe is going to be born. Well, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. We know that. But they had to back check after the Magi showed up, after pagans showed up to tell them. What does that say about God's people? Maybe we fall asleep. Maybe we don't pay attention to the own writings in the Bible that God has given us. And that God sometimes has to use pagans to come and inform the people of God to know about these events. They were so dumbfounded why the Pharisees and the Sadducees weren't, and the priests weren't excited. Why weren't you finding this baby king? And all Herod wanted to do was kill him. Matthew 2, these wise men who knew not the God of Israel brought the newborn king expensive offerings and gifts. Pagans bringing expensive offerings and gifts to Jesus Christ. Have you ever thought about that? Why wasn't his people bringing him expensive gifts? We're too busy giving gifts to each other. We don't bring gifts to the king. The way we celebrate the king's birthday is we party hard. But we don't bring things to him. But these pagan men, however many there were, 2 or more, brought gifts. And what was the significance of those gifts? Why were they important? Does anybody want to venture a guess? Because shortly, when Herod tried to kill, they had to flee. And this poor couple didn't have any money. And if it wasn't for those gifts, they couldn't have survived when they went down to Egypt. And it was because of these gifts, God protected Jesus and his family and gave them means with which they could go and run from Herod. Without those gifts, so God was planning and preparing for what was soon to take place. Gold, incense, and myrrh. And again, since there was 3 gifts, the assumption was there was 3 magi, but we don't know the number. So what did God do for us on his birthday? It was pretty evident, isn't it? He gave us salvation, didn't he? The beginning of salvation started on the birth of Christ. For without the birth, Jesus would not have become human. He could not have done the things that he did do. So this was the beginning step. In fact, at one time, I had a little nativity scene in which I put a cross above it, because at the nativity was the beginning steps to the cross. Jesus knew it. Mary knew it in her heart. She had been warned by the angel that this child would break her heart and all the events of his life. And Mary kept all these things inside of her as she watched this evolve throughout the life of Jesus. Have you ever put yourself in Mary's place as the mother of the Son of God, watching her son? At every stage, Jesus was different than the other children. Every stage, from infanthood all the way up. At 12 years old, he was teaching the smartest men in Israel and amazing them at 12 years of age. When he started his ministry, Mary must have been extremely confused. And how do you think she felt when she watched him being beaten and placed on the cross? Mary had a rough ride, didn't she? So the wise men brought gifts for Jesus. God ordained that pagans should take care of his son in his time of need. What do we do for Jesus? What do we do when we think of the birth of Christ? Now, I don't want to diminish the family aspects of Christmas. I love my family when it comes. We could be together. We make Christmas cookies. We have a good time together. We play games because it's a family event for us. But shouldn't Christmas or whatever be more when we think about the birth of Christ? Shouldn't we think about how we would repay him? Now, understandably, we can never repay Jesus for what he did, can we? Can we ever give back to him what he did for us? Never. We can never reach the magnitude of equaling his gift to us. But I do think there is something that we can give him. I think we could give him our hearts. I think we could dedicate our lives to him. I think on Christmas, the number one thing we should be thinking about is how I can live my life to honor the one who gave everything for me. Now, this is where I start to preach. You see, we think that if we give our tithes and offerings, we've given something back to Jesus. Well, maybe a little. You're only given a small portion of your income. We think if we come to church and Sabbath school once in a while, we're giving our lives to Jesus. Really? Seriously? Maybe if we stop sinning, and we're going to work our way into stop sinning. Do you know what the greatest gift you can give Jesus is? To tell somebody else about him. The greatest thing you can do for Jesus is to point to your friends and your family and the people you know and say, look at what he did for me. It's the greatest gift you can give him. because it's the gift of multiplication. You see, too often we are so focused on our own salvation. We are so focused on self, we forget that God has asked us to be co-laborers with Him in the plan of salvation to save the world, or whatever small part we can. So when we think of Christmas and we think about giving something back to Jesus, giving Him a gift, the first thing is giving Him our life, and the second thing is bringing another person to Jesus Christ. Those are the greatest things we can give Him. And we will do it imperfectly. We will make mistakes. I don't know how many times that I have said or done something that I could have maybe done better. But you see, God just needs us to be willing to be used. Because I believe that God takes our flawed, failing offerings and He turns them into beautiful things. He turns them into wonderful things. But you know, and this is something, I read a book a few years ago about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Does anybody know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Do you know who he is? Maybe we've moved too far in history. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran pastor who stood up to Hitler. He actually had fled Germany but decided to go back because he didn't want to leave his people, and he stood up against the Nazi regime. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of the attempt to take Hitler's life. He was plotting to, when the bomb went off and Hitler was almost killed. Some of you might have to go read this, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer was part of that. He also ended up in prison, and just as the Allies were less than a week away from freeing that prison, Hitler made sure Dietrich Bonhoeffer was killed. He was hung. He was never released. He had written a number of books, and this was an autobiography or a biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And there was a statement in there that always stuck with me, because Dietrich was called out as a Christian for being part of the plot to kill Hitler. That wasn't moral, that wasn't ethical. It was a Christian trying to kill another man. And he said something that always stuck out to me. It is better to do something wrong than to do nothing at all. You see, Hitler had been killing people, throwing people in prison. First he started with the Jews, then he went to the Catholics, then he went to the Protestants. And Bonhoeffer said, it is better to do something wrong than to do nothing in the face of evil. It is better to have a weak attempt than to sit back and say, I can't do anything for the king. It is better to do something than to do nothing. You see, because God cannot bless nothing, but He can bless even our mistakes. So don't be afraid that you might say the wrong thing, or that you might not be perfect in your presentation, that you may not have all the answers, because the only thing that's really important is you point people to Jesus. He's the solution, not me. It's not about pointing them to me. I don't do anything for you. But my friend Jesus can do everything for you. Jesus is the solution, not me. I want you to know my friend Jesus, and I want you to know that He loves you. So this Christmas, as you go home and you have your special meal with your family and you have your special Christmas activities, don't forget Jesus. Please don't forget Him. And if at all possible, make Him the center of your activities. So as you're opening the gifts and the kids are all excited, maybe you stop and say, what gift did Jesus give us? And how can we honestly give back? Something small. So we're going to end there. You can cut me off. I want to sing that song, How Many Kings? And my wife and daughter brought that. I think there's the word